The autumn of 1885 brought with it an unusual chill to Manhattan's Upper East Side, where Frederick Trump's newly constructed mansion stood like a monument to ambition against the darkening sky. Gas lamps flickered nervously in their sconces as carriages arrived one by one, depositing New York's most influential families onto the cobblestone driveway. The sound of horses' hooves echoed through the narrow streets, mixing with the distant rumble of thunder that promised a violent storm. Frederick stood at the grand entrance, his sharp blue eyes surveying each guest with the calculating gaze of a man who had clawed his way from the tenements of the Lower East Side to this pinnacle of society. His thick mustache twitched with satisfaction as he greeted the Astors, the Vanderbilts, and other titans of industry. Tonight was more than a social gathering. It was his declaration that the Trump name would be spoken in the same breath as America's most powerful dynasties. "Mr. Trump," called out William Backhouse Astor Jr., extending a gloved hand. "Magnificent home you've built here. The craftsmanship is extraordinary." Frederick's chest swelled with pride. "Only the finest materials, Mr. Astor. Imported marble from Italy, mahogany from Honduras, nothing but the best for those who dare to dream beyond their station." As the evening progressed, the mansion filled with the sounds of refined conversation, clinking crystal, and the soft melodies of a string quartet positioned in the corner of the grand ballroom. The walls, adorned with expensive paintings and gilded mirrors, reflected the warm glow of dozens of candles, creating an atmosphere of opulent sophistication. But as the storm outside intensified, rattling the tall windows with increasing violence, Frederick noticed a figure he didn't recognize standing alone near the fireplace. The man was tall and gaunt, dressed in an impeccably tailored black suit that seemed to absorb the light around him. His pale skin appeared almost translucent in the flickering candlelight, and his dark eyes held a depth that made Frederick's skin crawl with an inexplicable unease. "I don't believe we've been introduced," Frederick said, approaching the stranger with the confident stride of a man accustomed to commanding any room he entered. The stranger turned slowly, his thin lips curving into a smile that never reached his eyes. "Ah, Mr. Trump, the man of the hour. I am Cornelius Blackwood, and I've been observing your remarkable ascent with great interest." Frederick studied the man's face, searching for any hint of recognition. "Blackwood. I'm not familiar with that name in our circles. How did you come to be here tonight?" "Let's say I have a talent for finding men of exceptional ambition," Blackwood replied, his voice carrying a strange resonance that seemed to echo from somewhere deep within his chest. "Men who understand that true power requires sacrifice." The conversation around them continued, but Frederick felt as though he and Blackwood existed in a bubble of silence, isolated from the rest of the world. The stranger's presence was magnetic, yet deeply unsettling, like standing too close to the edge of a precipice. "I've heard whispers of your business dealings, Mr. Trump," Blackwood continued, his eyes never leaving Frederick's face. "The way you've acquired properties that others deemed worthless, how you've turned swampland into gold mines. Quite supernatural, one might say." Frederick's jaw tightened. His success hadn't come without cost. Bribes to city officials, intimidation of competitors, and deals made in the shadows of New York's underworld. But he had always justified these actions as necessary steps toward greatness. "I simply see opportunities where others see obstacles," Frederick replied carefully. Blackwood's smile widened, revealing teeth that seemed unnaturally white and sharp. "Indeed. But imagine if you could guarantee that success for not just yourself, but for your entire lineage. Imagine if the Trump name could become synonymous with power for generations to come." The storm outside reached a crescendo, and a brilliant flash of lightning illuminated the room, casting long, twisted shadows across the walls. In that moment, Frederick could have sworn he saw something inhuman flicker across Blackwood's features, something ancient and predatory. "What exactly are you proposing?" Frederick asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Blackwood reached into his coat and withdrew a rolled parchment tied with a black ribbon. The paper appeared old, far older than it should have been, and strange symbols were etched along its edges in what looked like dried blood. "A simple agreement," Blackwood said, offering the document to Frederick. "Your family's prosperity assured for all time. Wealth beyond imagination, influence that spans continents, power that grows with each passing generation." Frederick's hands trembled slightly as he took the parchment. The paper felt warm to the touch, almost alive, and he could swear he heard a faint whispering emanating from within its fibers. "And in return?" Frederick asked, though part of him already knew he didn't want to hear the answer. "A small tribute," Blackwood said, his voice now carrying an otherworldly quality that made the air itself seem to vibrate. "Every third generation, one of your bloodline must pay the price. Their life force will feed the pact, ensuring its continuation." Frederick's rational mind screamed warnings, but the promise of eternal prosperity was intoxicating. He thought of his young son, Fred, sleeping peacefully upstairs, and of the empire he could build for future generations of Trumps. "How do I know this isn't some elaborate hoax?" Frederick demanded. Blackwood gestured toward the window, where the storm raged with supernatural intensity. As if responding to his command, the wind suddenly died, the rain ceased, and an eerie calm settled over the mansion. The guests, who had been nervously glancing at the windows, relaxed and returned to their conversations, seemingly unaware of the abrupt change in weather. "Power recognizes power, Mr. Trump," Blackwood said. "The question is, are you willing to seize it?" Frederick stared at the parchment in his hands, feeling the weight of destiny pressing down upon him. In the distance, he could hear his wife Elizabeth's laughter mixing with the other guests, blissfully unaware of the choice that would determine the fate of their family for generations to come. With a hand that seemed to move of its own accord, Frederick reached for the ornate letter opener on the nearby desk. The blade gleamed in the candlelight as he drew it across his palm, watching as drops of his blood fell onto the ancient parchment. The moment his blood touched the paper, the symbols along its edges began to glow with a sickly green light, and Frederick felt a cold presence settle into his very soul. Blackwood's eyes blazed with triumph as he rolled up the now signed contract. "Excellent choice, Mr. Trump. Your descendants will thank you. Those who survive long enough to understand what you've given them." As the stranger melted back into the shadows of the room, Frederick stood alone by the fireplace, staring at the healing cut on his palm. The storm outside resumed with renewed fury, but he barely noticed. All he could think about was the promise of power, the guarantee of success, and the terrible price that would someday come due. The pact was sealed, and the Trump family's horrific lineage had begun. 27 years had passed since that fateful night, and the Trump family's fortune had grown beyond Frederick's wildest dreams. The year 1912 found them as one of New York's most prominent real estate dynasties, with properties spanning from the Bronx to Brooklyn. Frederick's son, Fred Trump, now a man of 27, had proven himself a worthy heir to the family's ruthless business acumen. The original mansion had been expanded twice, its Gothic architecture now sprawling across nearly an entire city block. Servants moved through its corridors like ghosts, their footsteps muffled by thick Persian carpets, while the walls displayed portraits of Trump ancestors whose eyes seemed to follow visitors with an unsettling intensity. Fred stood in his father's study, reviewing the latest acquisition reports by the light of a Tiffany lamp. The room was a testament to Frederick's success. Leather-bound books lined the walls, expensive artifacts from around the world adorned every surface, and a massive oil painting of the family patriarch dominated the space above the marble fireplace. "The Williamsburg properties are performing beyond expectations," Fred reported, his voice carrying the same calculating tone that had become a Trump family trademark. We've managed to evict the remaining tenants and can begin demolition next month. Frederick, now in his 60s but still possessing the sharp eyes and commanding presence of his youth, nodded approvingly from behind his mahogany desk. Excellent. And the city council? Properly motivated, Fred replied with a knowing smile. Councilman Morrison's gambling debts have made him quite cooperative. Albeit, as father and son discussed their empire's expansion, neither noticed the temperature in the room beginning to drop, or the way the shadows in the corners seemed to deepen and writhe with a life of their own. It wasn't until the grandfather clock in the hallway began chiming midnight that Frederick felt the familiar chill that had haunted him for nearly 3 decades. The study door opened without a sound, and Cornelius Blackwood stepped into the room, as if he had materialized from the darkness itself. He appeared unchanged by the passage of time, the same gaunt frame, the same pale skin, the same predatory smile that had sealed Frederick's fate all those years ago. Fred's hand instinctively moved toward the revolver he kept in his desk drawer, but his father's sharp gesture stopped him. Frederick had been expecting this visit, dreading it, yet knowing it was inevitable. "Mr. Blackwood," Frederick said, his voice steady despite the terror clawing at his chest. "I wondered when you would return." "The time has come to collect on our agreement," Blackwood replied, his voice carrying the same otherworldly resonance that had echoed through Frederick's nightmares for decades. 27 years of unprecedented prosperity. Your family's wealth has grown exponentially, just as promised. Fred looked between his father and the strange visitor, confusion and growing alarm evident in his expression. "Father, who is this man? What agreement?" Frederick's hands trembled as he opened the bottom drawer of his desk and withdrew the same ancient parchment he had signed so long ago. The blood-red symbols along its edges pulsed with a faint, sickly light, and the paper itself seemed to whisper with voices from beyond the grave. "This man," Frederick said, his voice barely above a whisper, "is the architect of our fortune and the collector of its price." Blackwood's smile widened as he approached Fred, who instinctively backed away until he was pressed against the bookshelf. "Your father made a bargain, young trump. Eternal prosperity for your bloodline, in exchange for a life every 3rd generation. You, I'm afraid, are the first payment." Fred's face went white as the implications hit him. "Father, you can't be serious. This is madness." "Look around you, son," Frederick said, gesturing to the opulent study and the empire beyond its walls. "Look at what we've built, what we've become. Do you think this level of success comes without cost?" As if responding to Blackwood's presence, the mansion itself began to change. The portraits on the walls seemed to move, their painted eyes following Fred's desperate movements. The books on the shelves rustled their pages like wings, and a low, rhythmic chanting began to emanate from the very walls. "The pact is binding," Blackwood continued, advancing on Fred with predatory grace. "Your life force will feed the contract, ensuring your family's continued prosperity. Your children and their children will inherit wealth beyond imagination." Fred drew his revolver and aimed it at Blackwood's chest, his hands shaking with terror and rage. "Stay back. I don't care what deal my father made. I won't be sacrificed for his ambition." Blackwood laughed, a sound like breaking glass and screaming wind. "Mortal weapons cannot harm me, child. I am bound to this realm by forces far older than your comprehension." Fred pulled the trigger, and the gunshot echoed through the study like thunder. But the bullet passed harmlessly through Blackwood's form, embedding itself in the wall behind him. The entity's smile never wavered as he reached out with one pale hand and touched Fred's forehead. The effect was instantaneous and horrifying. Fred's body convulsed as if struck by lightning, his eyes rolling back to show only white. His skin began to pale and wrinkle, aging decades in seconds as his life force was drained away. His hair turned gray, then white, then began to fall out in clumps. "Father!" Fred gasped, reaching out desperately toward Frederick. "Help me!" But Frederick remained frozen behind his desk, watching in horror as his son paid the price for his ambition. Tears streamed down his face, but he made no move to intervene. The pact was absolute, and he knew that any attempt to interfere would only bring worse consequences upon his family. Within minutes, Fred Trump was dead, his body aged to that of a 90-year-old man, his face locked in an expression of absolute terror. Blackwood stepped back, his form now more solid and vibrant, as if Fred's life force had strengthened his connection to the mortal realm. "The first harvest is complete," Blackwood announced, his voice now carrying harmonics that seemed to come from multiple throats. "Your grandson will inherit not only your wealth, but also the burden of continuation. In another generation, the pact will demand its due once more." Frederick stared at his son's withered corpse, the weight of his choices crushing down upon him like a physical force. "What have I done?" he whispered. "You have ensured your family's place in history," Blackwood replied. "The Trump name will echo through the ages, carried by those who understand that true power requires sacrifice. Your grandson will be born within the year, and he will inherit gifts that will make your current success seem like poverty." As Blackwood began to fade back into the shadows, his final words hung in the air like a curse. "Remember, Frederick Trump, every empire is built on bones. Your family's empire will be no different." The study fell silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock and Frederick's ragged breathing. He sat alone with his son's corpse, understanding for the first time the true cost of the power he had sought. The Trump fortune would continue to grow, but it would forever be stained with the blood of his descendants. Outside, storm clouds gathered once again over Manhattan, and in the distance, the first cries of a newborn could be heard, the next generation of Trumps, born into a legacy of wealth and horror that would define their bloodline for generations to come. The year 1938 brought with it an atmosphere of tension that seemed to permeate every corner of the Trump mansion. Donald Trump, now 26 years old and the sole heir to the family empire, stood in the same study where his father had met his gruesome end. The room had been meticulously restored, but those who knew its history claimed they could still feel the lingering presence of death within its walls. Donald possessed the same sharp features and calculating eyes that had defined the Trump lineage, but there was something else in his gaze. A haunted quality that spoke of sleepless nights and terrible dreams. Since childhood, he had been plagued by visions of his father's death, nightmares that grew more vivid and disturbing with each passing year. His grandfather Frederick, now in his 80s and confined to a wheelchair, watched from the corner of the study as Donald reviewed the latest business reports. The old man's once commanding presence had withered to a shadow of its former self, his eyes hollow with the weight of decades of guilt and terror. "The Atlantic City project is proceeding ahead of schedule," Donald reported, his voice carrying the same authoritative tone that had become synonymous with the Trump name. "We've secured the necessary permits and eliminated the competition through conventional means." Frederick nodded weakly, but his attention was focused on the grandfather clock in the hallway. It was nearly midnight, the same time Blackwood had appeared 26 years ago to claim Fred's life. The old man had been counting down to this moment for years, knowing that the entity would return to collect the next payment. "Donald," Frederick said, his voice barely above a whisper, "there are things about our family's success that you need to understand. Things I should have told you years ago." Donald looked up from his papers, noting the fear in his grandfather's eyes. "What are you talking about, grandfather? You've told me everything about the business, about how we built this empire." "Not everything," Frederick replied, his hands trembling as he reached for the bottom drawer of the desk. "There was a price for our prosperity. A terrible price that I paid without considering the consequences for future generations." As Frederick's fingers closed around the ancient parchment, the temperature in the room began to plummet. The gas lamps flickered and dimmed, casting dancing shadows across the walls that seemed to move independently of their sources. Donald felt a chill run down his spine as he recognized the same supernatural presence that had haunted his dreams since childhood. The study door opened silently, and Cornelius Blackwood stepped into the room with the same predatory grace he had displayed decades earlier. If anything, he appeared more solid now, more real, as if the life force he had consumed from Fred Trump had strengthened his connection to the mortal realm. "Good evening, gentlemen," Blackwood said, his voice carrying harmonics that made the very air vibrate with malevolent energy. "I trust you've been expecting me." Donald's hand instinctively moved toward the desk drawer where he kept his father's revolver, but Frederick's sharp gesture stopped him. The old man had learned from bitter experience that conventional weapons were useless against this entity. "You're him," Donald said, his voice steady despite the terror clawing at his chest. "The one from my dreams, the one who killed my father." Blackwood's smile widened, revealing teeth that seemed to have grown sharper and more numerous since his last visit. "Your father's death was not murder, young Trump. It was payment for services rendered. Just as your death will be payment for the continued prosperity of your bloodline." Frederick struggled to rise from his wheelchair, his aged body trembling with effort and emotion. "Take me instead," he pleaded. "I'm the one who made the bargain. Let my grandson live." "The pact is specific," Blackwood replied, his dark eyes never leaving Donald's face. "Every third generation, one of the bloodline must pay. Your grandson has inherited not only your wealth, but also your debt." Donald stood slowly, his mind racing as he tried to process the implications of what he was hearing. "What exactly did you promise him?" he demanded, gesturing toward his grandfather. "Eternal prosperity for the Trump name," Blackwood answered. "Wealth beyond imagination, influence that spans continents, power that grows with each passing generation. Your family's success has been guaranteed by forces far older than human civilization." As if to demonstrate his power, Blackwood gestured toward the windows, and the storm clouds that had been gathering over Manhattan suddenly erupted into a supernatural tempest. Lightning struck the mansion repeatedly, but instead of causing damage, each bolt seemed to strengthen the building's foundations and enhance its grandeur. "Look around you," Blackwood continued. "Your family owns properties in every major city in America. Your influence extends into politics, entertainment, and industry. You have wealth that most men can only dream of, and it will continue to grow exponentially with each generation." Donald felt a terrible understanding beginning to dawn. Every success his family had achieved, every deal that had gone their way, every obstacle that had mysteriously disappeared, all of it had been orchestrated by this supernatural entity in exchange for the lives of his descendants. "But there's more," Blackwood said, his form beginning to shimmer and change. "Your death will not be the end of your contribution to the family legacy. Your life force will be bound to the pact, ensuring that future generations of Trumps possess abilities beyond normal human comprehension." The entity's true form began to reveal itself, something ancient and terrible that existed between dimensions, feeding on human ambition and sustained by the life force of those who dared to bargain with powers beyond their understanding. Its presence filled the room with an oppressive weight that made breathing difficult and thinking nearly impossible. "Your son will be born with an intuitive understanding of human weakness," Blackwood continued, his voice now coming from multiple sources simultaneously. "He will possess an almost supernatural ability to manipulate others, to bend them to his will through words alone. These gifts will make him the most powerful Trump in your family's history." Donald's mind reeled as he considered the implications. A son with supernatural abilities, born from his death and bound to continue the family's cursed legacy. The thought was both terrifying and oddly compelling. His sacrifice would ensure that the Trump name achieved heights of power that previous generations could never have imagined. "And if I refuse?" Donald asked, though he already knew the answer. Blackwood's laughter filled the room like the sound of breaking bones. "Refusal is not an option. The pact is binding across all dimensions of existence. You can die willingly and ensure your son's gifts are strong, or you can resist and watch as your entire bloodline suffers for your defiance." Frederick watched in horror as his grandson began to consider the entity's words. The old man had spent decades living with the guilt of his choice, and now he was witnessing the same terrible decision being forced upon another generation. "There is another way," Donald said suddenly, his voice taking on a calculating tone that was pure Trump. "What if I could provide you with something more valuable than my life? What if I could offer you access to power on a scale you've never experienced?" Blackwood's multiple eyes focused on Donald with predatory interest. "Explain." Donald gestured toward the newspapers scattered across the desk, their headlines speaking of war brewing in Europe and the growing influence of charismatic leaders who could sway entire nations with their words. "The world is changing. Traditional power structures are crumbling and new forms of influence are emerging. What if the Trump family could provide you with access to political power on a global scale?" The entity's form solidified as it considered Donald's proposal. "You speak of influence over nations rather than mere business empires." "Exactly," Donald replied, his confidence growing as he sensed Blackwood's interest. "My death would give you one life force and ensure my son's supernatural abilities. But my continued existence, combined with those same abilities transferred to me, could give you access to power structures that span continents." Frederick watched in amazement as his grandson negotiated with the supernatural entity that had terrorized their family for decades. It was a display of the same ruthless ambition that had defined the Trump lineage, but applied to stakes higher than any previous generation had dared to imagine. Blackwood circled Donald like a predator, evaluating its prey, his multiple forms casting impossible shadows across the study walls. "You propose to alter the terms of a pact that has stood for over 50 years. "I propose to expand them," Donald corrected. "Give me the abilities you would have given my son, and I will ensure that the Trump name achieves political influence that will make our current wealth seem insignificant." Imagine the life force you could harvest from entire populations who willingly surrender their will to Trump charisma. The entity's eyes blazed with an otherworldly light as it considered the possibilities. Political power on a global scale, millions of people influenced by supernatural charisma, entire nations potentially under the sway of the Trump bloodline. It was a tempting offer that could provide far more sustenance than a single life force. "Very well," Blackwood said finally, his voice carrying the weight of cosmic forces. "The pact will be modified. You will receive the abilities intended for your son, but the price will be paid by your bloodline in other ways. Your descendants will be bound to seek power at any cost, driven by an insatiable hunger that can never be satisfied. They will achieve great heights, but they will also face great falls, and their suffering will feed the pact just as surely as death." Donald felt a surge of triumph as he realized he had successfully negotiated with forces beyond human comprehension. But as Blackwood reached out to touch his forehead, transferring the supernatural abilities that would define the rest of his life, he also felt the weight of a new curse settling upon his bloodline, one that would drive future generations to seek power with a desperation that bordered on madness. The deal was struck, and the Trump family's destiny was forever altered. 50 years had passed since Donald Trump's fateful negotiation with Cornelius Blackwood, and the consequences of that supernatural bargain had begun to manifest in ways that defied human understanding. The year 1988 found the Trump empire at its zenith, with properties spanning the globe and influence reaching into the highest echelons of politics and entertainment. Donald, now in his 70s but possessing a vitality that seemed to defy natural aging, stood on the balcony of his penthouse atop Trump Tower, surveying the Manhattan skyline that bore his name on dozens of buildings. The supernatural abilities granted to him by Blackwood had proven more powerful than he had ever imagined. An almost hypnotic charisma that could bend others to his will, an intuitive understanding of human weakness that made manipulation effortless, and a presence that commanded attention and obedience from even the strongest personalities. But the price of these gifts was becoming increasingly apparent. His children, Donald Jr., as Ivanka and Eric, had inherited diluted versions of his abilities, along with an insatiable hunger for power that consumed their every waking moment. They moved through high society like predators, their supernatural charisma masking an emptiness that could never be filled. The family's success had attracted attention from forces both mortal and otherworldly. Government agencies had begun investigating their business practices, finding patterns of influence and manipulation that seemed to defy logical explanation. More disturbing were the reports from family members of strange dreams, visions of their ancestors, and encounters with shadows that moved independently of their sources. Donald's wife, Ivana, had been the first to notice the changes in their children. She found them in the mansion's library one evening, standing perfectly still in a circle around an ancient book that none of them remembered acquiring. The tome was bound in what appeared to be human skin and filled with symbols that hurt to look at directly. "They've been like this for hours," Ivana whispered to Donald as they watched from the doorway. "They won't respond to anything I say." Donald felt a familiar chill as he recognized the supernatural presence that had haunted his family for generations. The book was clearly connected to Blackwood's realm, and its appearance suggested that the entity was preparing to collect on some aspect of their modified pact. As if summoned by his thoughts, Cornelius Blackwood materialized in the center of the library, his form more solid and imposing than ever before. The decades of feeding on the Trump family's supernatural influence had strengthened him considerably, and his presence now radiated a power that made the very air crackle with malevolent energy. "Good evening, Donald," Blackwood said, his voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate from multiple dimensions simultaneously. "I trust you've been satisfied with the modifications to our arrangement." Donald stepped protectively in front of his wife, though he knew that conventional protection was meaningless against this entity. "What do you want with my children?" "They are the next phase of our agreement," Blackwood replied, his dark eyes reflecting depths that seemed to contain entire universes. "Your supernatural abilities have served their purpose, establishing the Trump name as a force of global influence. Now it's time for the bloodline to evolve further." The children, Donald Jr., Ivanka, and Eric, remained motionless, their eyes fixed on the ancient tome, as if reading words that existed beyond normal perception. Their breathing had synchronized into a rhythm that matched some cosmic heartbeat, and their skin had taken on a pale, almost translucent quality. "What are you doing to them?" Ivana demanded, her voice breaking with maternal terror. Blackwood's smile revealed teeth that had grown even sharper and more numerous since his last manifestation. "I am preparing them for their destiny. The political influence you promised me, Donald, requires agents who can operate on a scale beyond normal human comprehension. Your children will become vessels for power that transcends mortal limitations." Donald felt the supernatural abilities that Blackwood had granted him decades earlier beginning to resonate with the entity's presence. He could sense the cosmic forces at work, the way reality itself was being bent and shaped to accommodate powers that existed beyond the normal laws of physics. "The world is changing," Blackwood continued, his form beginning to shift and expand until it filled the entire library. Traditional power structures are crumbling, and new forms of influence are emerging. Your family will be at the center of these changes, wielding authority that spans not just nations but dimensions. The ancient book began to glow with the same sickly green light that had marked the original pact, and the symbols on its pages started to move and rearrange themselves into new configurations. Each change seemed to correspond with alterations in the children's appearance, their eyes taking on an otherworldly gleam, their voices beginning to carry harmonics that could influence listeners on a subconscious level. They will retain their human appearance and personalities, Blackwood explained, but they will possess abilities that make your current gifts seem primitive by comparison. They will be able to influence entire populations through media and technology, bending the will of millions to serve the family's ambitions. Donald watched in fascination and horror as his children underwent their supernatural transformation. Part of him was thrilled by the prospect of power on such an unprecedented scale, but another part recognized the terrible cost of what was happening. His children were being transformed into something that was no longer entirely human. "And what happens to them when this is over?" Donald asked. "What happens when you've achieved whatever cosmic goal you're working toward?" Blackwood's laughter filled the library, like the sound of reality itself tearing apart. "There is no over, Donald Trump. The pact is eternal, and your bloodline is now bound to serve purposes that extend far beyond your mortal comprehension. Your descendants will achieve heights of power that previous generations could never have imagined, but they will also face challenges that will test the very limits of their sanity." As the transformation reached its climax, the children's eyes suddenly snapped open, revealing irises that swirled with colors that didn't exist in normal human perception. When they spoke, their voices carried an authority that seemed to bypass rational thought and speak directly to the listener's subconscious mind. "We understand," they said in perfect unison, their words carrying harmonics that made the library's windows vibrate. "We accept our role in the family's destiny." Ivana collapsed to her knees, overwhelmed by the supernatural presence that now radiated from her own children. Donald helped her to her feet, but he could see in her eyes the same recognition that had haunted his grandfather, Frederick. The understanding that their family's success had come at a price that would echo through generations. "The next phase begins now," Blackwood announced as his form began to fade back into the shadows. "Your children will enter the world of politics and media, using their enhanced abilities to build influence on a scale that will reshape human civilization. The Trump name will become synonymous with power itself." As the entity disappeared, leaving only the lingering scent of sulfur and the echo of otherworldly laughter, Donald looked at his transformed children and realized that he had successfully negotiated his family into a position of unprecedented power. But he also understood that they were no longer entirely his children. They were something new, something that existed at the intersection of human ambition and cosmic forces beyond mortal comprehension. The Trump bloodline had evolved, and the world would never be the same. The year 2016 marked the culmination of over a century of supernatural manipulation and cosmic ambition. Donald Trump, now 70 years old, but possessing the vitality and presence of a man half his age, stood before a crowd of thousands as he accepted the Republican nomination for President of the United States. The supernatural abilities granted to him by Cornelius Blackwood had reached their full potential, allowing him to command attention and loyalty from millions of Americans who found themselves inexplicably drawn to his message. But beneath the triumph of his political ascension, darker forces were stirring. The enhanced abilities that Blackwood had granted to his children had begun to manifest in ways that defied human understanding. Donald Jr., Ivanka, and Eric moved through the political landscape like supernatural predators, their otherworldly charisma allowing them to influence key figures in government, media, and industry with an ease that bordered on the miraculous. The Trump family's success, however, had not gone unnoticed by other entities that existed in the spaces between dimensions. Ancient powers that had slumbered for millennia were beginning to awaken, drawn by the cosmic disturbances created by the family's supernatural influence. The very fabric of reality around the Trump bloodline had become thin and unstable, allowing things from other realms to seep through into the mortal world. In the depths of the original Trump mansion, now converted into a private family sanctuary, Frederick Trump's portrait hung above the fireplace in the same study where the original pact had been signed. But those who looked closely at the painting reported that the old man's eyes seemed to move, following visitors with an expression of infinite regret and warning. It was in this room that Ivanka Trump found herself on the night before the election, drawn by dreams that had been growing more vivid and disturbing with each passing week. The supernatural abilities granted to her by Blackwood came with a price. Visions of the past and glimpses of possible futures that threatened to drive her to madness. As she stood before her great-great-grandfather's portrait, the temperature in the room began to drop, and the familiar presence of Cornelius Blackwood began to manifest. But this time, he was not alone. Other entities accompanied him, beings of shadow and flame that existed in the spaces between thoughts, cosmic parasites that fed on human ambition and suffering. "The time has come for the final phase," Blackwood announced, his form now so solid and imposing that he seemed more real than the physical world around him. "Your family's influence has reached the threshold necessary to open permanent gateways between dimensions." Ivanka felt her enhanced abilities responding to the entity's presence, but instead of the usual sense of power and control, she experienced something new: fear. The visions that had been haunting her dreams suddenly crystallized into terrible clarity, showing her glimpses of a future where the Trump bloodline served as conduits for forces that would reshape humanity itself. "What do you mean by final phase?" Ivanka asked, her voice carrying the supernatural harmonics that had become second nature to her, but now tinged with uncertainty. Blackwood's smile revealed that his teeth had evolved beyond anything remotely human, rows of crystalline fangs that seemed to contain trapped souls writhing in eternal torment. "Your father's presidency will serve as the catalyst for a transformation that extends far beyond politics. The office itself will become a focal point for cosmic energies, allowing us to influence not just this nation, but the entire planet." The other entities that accompanied Blackwood began to take more defined forms, beings that defied description, with geometries that hurt to perceive directly, and voices that spoke in languages that predated human civilization. They circled the study like vultures, their presence causing the very walls to warp and bend as reality struggled to accommodate their existence. "Every decision your father makes as president will be guided by forces beyond his comprehension," one of the shadow beings whispered, its voice like the sound of dying stars. "Wars will be started and ended according to cosmic timetables. Economic systems will rise and fall to feed our hunger for chaos and transformation." Ivanka's enhanced perception allowed her to see the true scope of what was being planned. The Trump presidency would not simply be about political power. It would serve as a beachhead for an invasion from dimensions where different laws of physics and morality applied. Her family had unknowingly become the advance guard for entities that viewed human civilization as nothing more than a source of sustenance. "And what happens to us?" she demanded. "What happens to my family when you've achieved your goals?" Blackwood's laughter filled the study with harmonics that shattered several antique vases and caused the portrait of Frederick Trump to begin weeping tears of blood. "Your family will be rewarded beyond your wildest dreams. You will become the ruling dynasty of a transformed Earth, wielding power over billions of humans who will worship you as living gods." But even as he spoke these words, Ivanka could see the truth in his otherworldly eyes. The Trump bloodline would indeed rule, but they would do so as puppets of forces that cared nothing for human welfare or happiness. They would become the face of a cosmic tyranny that would reduce humanity to livestock, bred and harvested for the sustenance of beings from beyond the stars. The study door burst open, and Donald Trump himself strode into the room, his supernatural presence immediately clashing with the assembled entities. The decades of enhancement had transformed him into something that existed at the boundary between human and otherworldly, and his arrival caused the very air to crackle with competing energies. "Enough!" he commanded, his voice carrying authority that made even Blackwood's companions recoil slightly. "I've fulfilled my part of our bargain. My family has achieved the political influence you demanded, but I won't allow you to use us as instruments for the destruction of our own species." Blackwood's form expanded until it filled the entire study, his presence so overwhelming that the mansion's foundations began to crack and shift. "You misunderstand the nature of our agreement, Donald Trump. You negotiated for power, and power you have received. But power always comes with obligations that extend beyond the original bargain." The cosmic entities began to close in around Donald and Ivanka, their alien geometries creating patterns that seemed to exist in more dimensions than human perception could process. But as they approached, something unexpected happened. The blood-stained symbols on the original pact, still hidden in the desk drawer, began to glow with a different kind of light. Frederick Trump's portrait suddenly spoke, his painted lips moving with words that carried the weight of a century of regret. "The pact can be broken, but only through the willing sacrifice of the entire bloodline. The cosmic debt must be paid in full, or it will continue to grow until it consumes not just your family, but your entire world." Donald felt the supernatural abilities that had defined his adult life beginning to resonate with his great-grandfather's words. He understood now that the original bargain had been designed to evolve and expand, trapping each generation deeper in a web of cosmic obligation that could never be fully satisfied through conventional means. "There is another way," Ivanka said suddenly, her enhanced perception allowing her to see possibilities that existed beyond normal human comprehension. "The entities need our bloodline to maintain their connection to this dimension. But what if we could sever that connection, while simultaneously redirecting their influence towards something that would benefit humanity rather than destroy it?" Blackwood's multiple eyes focused on her with predatory interest. "Explain." Ivanka gestured toward the windows, where the lights of Manhattan twinkled like stars in the darkness. "You want to transform human civilization, but transformation doesn't have to mean destruction. What if the Trump bloodline could serve as a bridge between dimensions, allowing for an exchange of knowledge and power that elevates humanity rather than enslaving it?" The cosmic entities began to communicate among themselves in languages that existed beyond sound, their alien thoughts creating patterns of light and shadow that danced across the study walls. Donald watched his daughter negotiate with forces beyond human comprehension, recognizing in her the same ruthless intelligence that had defined the Trump lineage for generations. "You propose a symbiosis rather than a conquest," Blackwood said finally, his voice carrying notes of genuine curiosity. "Humanity enhanced by cosmic knowledge, guided by the Trump bloodline toward a future that serves both mortal and immortal interests." "Exactly," Ivanka replied. "My family retains its power and influence, but we use it to shepherd humanity through a transformation that benefits everyone. You gain access to a willing population that can serve your purposes without the resistance and suffering that would come from forced subjugation." Donald felt a surge of pride as he watched his daughter turn the entity's own cosmic ambitions against them. It was a negotiation worthy of the Trump name, transforming what had seemed like inevitable doom into an opportunity for unprecedented power and influence. But as the entities considered Ivanka's proposal, Frederick Trump's portrait spoke again. his voice carrying a warning that chilled the supernatural atmosphere of the study. Beware the price of such bargains. Power shared is power that can be taken away. And entities that exist beyond time and space do not honor agreements in the same way that mortals do. The negotiation continued through the night, with the fate of humanity hanging in the balance as the Trump bloodline faced the ultimate test of their supernatural abilities. Outside, dawn was breaking over Manhattan, and in a few hours, the election results would determine whether Donald Trump would become the most powerful man on Earth. But in the study where it all began, the real battle was being fought between forces that existed beyond politics, beyond nations, and beyond the normal understanding of power itself. The Trump family's horrific lineage had reached its culmination, and the choices made in that room would determine not just their own destiny, but the future of human civilization itself. As Cornelius Blackwood and his cosmic companions considered the new terms being offered, the ancient pact that had bound the Trump bloodline for over a century began to evolve once again, transforming into something that would reshape the very nature of reality. The curse of endless ambition had become something far more complex and dangerous, a bridge between worlds that would either elevate humanity to cosmic significance or damn it to eternal servitude under the rule of beings that viewed mortal life as nothing more than a resource to be harvested. The Trump legacy would endure, but in forms that Frederick Trump could never have imagined when he first signed his name in blood on that fateful night in 1885. The family's horrific lineage had become something that transcended horror itself, evolving into a cosmic force that would influence the destiny of worlds yet to be born. And in the depths of the mansion where it all began, the portraits of dead Trumps watched with eyes that held the wisdom of the damned, knowing that some prices can never be fully paid and some ambitions can never be fully satisfied. The cycle was complete, but it was also just beginning.